The IRS wants U.S. citizens to be honest about paying their tax obligations. But who keeps the IRS on its toes? For the last 25 years, that's been the job of the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, known as TIGTA. It started in 1999 following landmark congressional overhaul of the IRS. That was in 1998. Here with a review, Senior Advisor Matt Schimmel. Mr. Schimmel, good to have you in.
Good to be here.
And so the TIGTA then did not result from the Inspectors General Act, but from specific IRS legislation.
That's correct. So there's about 70 some odd inspectors general across the federal government, and they're all designed to provide oversight of the individual agency that they oversee, looking for fraud, waste, and abuse, and identifying programmatic improvements. And most of the 70 some odd IGs have their origins with the Inspector General Act of 1978, but we came about 20 years after that. Prior to our creation in 1999, we were within the IRS for several decades, and it was sort of seen as a technical correction to the 1978 legislation where the oversight function within IRS was internal, reported directly to the IRS commissioner, and now we are separate, provide oversight, no longer report to the
right.
To the IRS commissioner.
The events that led to that 1998 overhaul of the IRS, and that went on for several years, was at that time, I think Congress saw it as a little bit of a rogue agency.
Yeah, there was a history there of what was seen as an enforcement first type culture with less of an emphasis on customer service. So this was an attempt by Congress to really restructure and reorganize the IRS so that it was focused on taxpayers and certain segments of taxpayers, and then also to beef up some of the taxpayer rights that we've always had, but codified those in several ways.
And there's another whole structure at the IRS called the Taxpayer Advocate, which is kind of looks like an inspector general in some respects. How do you interoperate with, say, the taxpayer advocate and make sure you're not both piling on the same issue, for example?
So that's a great question, and that's one of the reasons that we wanted to do a 25-year type social media campaign to really demystify who we are, what we do, and even though we're 25 years may seem like a long time, we are relatively new compared to the rest of the IG community. That's what inspector generals are commonly called, IGs. And it's somewhat compounded for TIGTA because there are several organizations, Taxpayer Advocate Service being one of them, but Government Accountability Office, and then IRS also has several internal advisory groups. So we're all kind of providing comprehensive oversight of the IRS, but doing so from different perspectives. We might have different statutory authorities, different areas of jurisdiction. And so the Taxpayer Advocate Service, they can help resolve individual cases that you're having. If you've been working with the IRS and have not been able to resolve your issue, the Taxpayer Advocate Service can step in and help you on an individual basis. But they also do systemic reviews to look at opportunities to make it easier to resolve an identity theft case that you have with the IRS.
Sure.
So, and that's where we kind of overlap. We do some of those larger programmatic reviews, systemic areas of IRS operations. We don't look at individual cases.
Right. Well, another way to look at it is they might look at the effect of what happens at the IRS, but you would look at what's going on, and I'm thinking of tax systems modernization, which actually predates TIGTA. I mean, they started that in the early 90s and still not there yet. But the lack of modernization or the failure of one of the modernization projects could have an effect that the advocate would look at, but you would look at what went wrong internally here, that they spent this money and didn't get what they wanted.
Absolutely. And I information technology modernization is a huge point of emphasis for our workload. It's one of the major challenges that we've identified for the IRS. And a lot of the computer systems that the IRS has predate TIGTA, to your point. And so we've been really on top of seeing how they're modernizing those and decommissioning some of the older systems that are no longer relevant. And it's funny, as part of this campaign, we've kind of been looking at, it's one of these things, the more that things change, the more they stay the same. And IT modernization had a little bit of a different flavor back in 1999 when we started. You might remember Y2K conversion efforts. And that was a very big issue for the IRS in particular, because if the computer programming codes were not changed or revised, it would have potentially stopped the processing of a tax return. So some of our earliest work was to look at Y2K conversion efforts at the IRS to make sure that they were prepared to handle it. And now, IT modernization as a concept still lingers, except, the issues might look a little bit different. Cloud computing, the adoption of that, and then, like I said, decommissioning of older systems.
We're speaking with Matt Schimmel. He's Senior Advisor at the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration as it celebrates 25 years. And usually 25-year marks are retrospectives on some of the highlights. And notwithstanding that highlights of Inspector General work might seem like an oxymoron, what are some of the highlights?
So, it has been fun to look back and reflect on all the accomplishments that we've had over the last quarter century. And there might be a little bit of recency bias at play here, but, one of the investigations that we're most proud of is one where earlier this year an IRS contractor was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the unauthorized disclosure, access and disclosure of thousands of taxpayer records to multiple news organizations. And so that's an example of some of the work that our Office of Investigations does. They will investigate any sort of external attempts to affect the integrity of tax administration, and the unauthorized access and disclosure of taxpayer information, sensitive taxpayer information, is something that we take very seriously. So that's just an individual example of a case that we've done. We're also, our Office of Inspections and Evaluations is doing did a larger review on the heels of that sentencing to kind of look at how do IRS employees go about accessing data? How do they get access? Who has access to this data? And so provided this sort of landscape view of who has data at the IRS. And there's 92,000 IRS employees and contractors that have access to nearly 300 different systems. And what we found in that review was that audit trail logs, for example, which are a very effective tool for our investigators to use to kind of track down and figure out, well, who accessed it, the data. That was one of the findings that came out of that report, and it was just recently recognized. I think it's a great report, but it was also recognized by CIGI, which is the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, sort of a clearinghouse of sorts for all the IGs, has an annual award ceremony, and they recognized that specific project.
I imagine data analytics must be coming big time into the work that you do because, for example, to continue, if you are looking at what people are accessing, that all generates logs. Logs are data that can be analyzed to find out why is Charlie there, keep looking at Brad Pitt's return or something, that type of thing. Absolutely.
So IRS collects a ton of data. They're processing hundreds of millions of tax returns every year. They collect nearly $5 trillion in payments. Taxpayers will send in supporting documentation. There's phone calls. All of these records, all of these payments, all of these returns form data, and it's something that we have to use to do our work. And back in the day, we would have to, before the evolution of data analytics, you would have to have our auditors would pull a sample of cases and review those manually and then project to a population. But now with the power of data analytics, we're able to analyze entire populations of data.
Right, so no more sampling.
Yeah, we're working smarter, we're working faster, and we're providing a more complete picture. So the analogy that we like to use sometimes is that, if you think of IRS employees and taxpayers as a big haystack, back in the day, we would have to take a little tiny piece of that haystack and review it and hope that we found a few needles and then project. But now we're able to, through the power of data analytics, is to drag a magnet through that entire haystack and collect all the needles that we know that are going to be in there.
And the other issue, I wonder how you look at this one, is from time to time, the periodic accusations of, now they call it weaponization, or administrations using the IRS for political purposes. I remember these charges going back to the Nixon administration.
Right.
Let's, audit the SOB, I think the Nixon White House tapes said. And then there was the Lois Lerner episode during the Obama administration, still not fully resolved in many, many minds, even though the president at the time said there was not a smidgen of corruption, that type of thing. How do you keep an even keel and look at those things objectively and to make sure that doesn't happen to the IRS in any organized way?
Right. It's just it's making sure that we ingrain into our staff the importance of being independent and objective. And, we've got quite a track record over 25 years of doing our work in just that type of manner.
Because that really gets to the idea of credibility, and that's something that if the public may not like paying taxes, but if they believe in the credibility of the IRS, then at least you won't have that element of defiance,
right,
because they don't think the agency itself is fair.
Yeah, and here's a good example of that. So if you think about prior abuses, for lack of a better word, that kind of almost predate the existence of TIGTA, there was a concern at the time when Congress did create the Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998, of which TIGTA has our genesis. Congress was concerned that the IRS was labeling people as illegal tax protesters in the case files. And so the concern was it would stigmatize taxpayers, labeling them, and they might get unfair treatment because of that label. And so we do annual review